There are certain mistakes that are commonly made in business studies. They're made in exams, in tests, and in assessments. It's essential for us to know, first of all, what these mistakes are, and also how do we guide our learners through them so they can improve on their results. The first mistake that learners often make is not being able to demonstrate a level of understanding. Learners struggle with reading the question. They don't read the question correctly. They also don't identify what sort of answer is required. And this is often because they don't look at the actual cognitive level required. So they don't answer the correct or to the correct cognitive level. Often learners just regurgitate facts. They don't justify their answer. In the first example, they asked to justify why leaders should use different styles. And what learners do is they don't give examples and characteristics of the different leadership styles. They just give the facts. The second is where learners are asked to distinguish between a manager and a leader. Here they give the facts again or definitions, but they don't actually compare the two. And in the third example, learners struggle to identify what is actually being asked. So they tend in this question to write about the development strategies themselves instead of how to evaluate strategies. And this is an example of where cognitive levels are not used. They don't understand what is required in the answer. Now, how do we help the learners? The first is we've got to emphasize the importance of both factual knowledge and the application of this knowledge to all scenarios and examples. We need to discourage regurgitation of facts. So when we're asking them questions in class, we can't just get factual answers. We want to get their opinions. We want them to justify their answers. Expose the learners to a variety of questions and coach them on how to answer these questions. Give them a lot of practice. And most importantly, give them a list of keywords and what these keywords mean. For example, what does the word compare and distinguish mean if they get an exam paper? Attached to this lesson is a PDF that you can download and print out and give it to your learners. And it's a list of all the keywords that they may come across in the exam paper. Now, the second common mistake is learners not planning the answer. They often don't take time to plan their answers correctly before they actually write them down. And we need to teach them to be able to do this. Here's an example. In this case, learners tended to focus more on the advantages and disadvantages, but the answers were not organized under the correct headings or subheadings. So learners focused too much on the socio-economic issues instead of the CSI. The second example is examine the impact of quality on small and large businesses. Learners forget to examine both small and large businesses. They must always state whether the impact belongs in a small or large business. Now, how do we help the learners? We need to emphasize the importance of planning and make sure they avoid repetition. We need to emphasize to them that planning will help them to answer the question correctly. We need to demonstrate to the learner how to structure an effective answer. And most importantly, make sure the learners understand the value and how to use headings and subheadings. The third common mistake is that learners are not able to calculate. Firstly, learners aren't familiar with the general formulae and calculations needed for business studies. Learners haven't learned their formulae properly or don't learn their formulae properly. And often that means that they're not able to apply the correct formulae or apply any formulae at all. An example of this is where they're asked to work out or calculate something dependent on a particular formulae. And in this case, learners aren't able to calculate the claim compensation. Learners must know what reinstatement is and when the insurer repairs and replaces and does not pay for damage. And they get very confused with all the terminology and which formulae to use. Now, how do we help the learners? Learners should be familiar with the formulae. We need to provide a list of formulae to the learners and make sure they practice this formulae in all different situations and in appropriate. We need to emphasize the importance of becoming familiar with procedures and different steps of calculation. And most importantly, we need to emphasize the marks that they could lose unnecessarily if they're not confident with their formulae and calculations. The fourth common mistake is that learners are not able to distinguish between content. Often learners give irrelevant content in an answer, and also they confuse concepts and terminology. Have a look at the example there. They need to distinguish between mediation and arbitration. Often learners state that they both help in conflicting parties to resolve conflict. However, that is a similarity and not a difference. In the second example, they asked to identify 3 situations where autocratic leadership style would be successful. The learners here tend to focus on the characteristics instead of giving examples of where it can be successful. Now, how do we help the learners? We need to guide them by emphasizing the importance of understanding the facts and not just learning them off by heart. We also need to look at the importance and emphasize the importance of reading the questions carefully, and then of course answering them correctly. As teachers, we should provide suitable examples in class of different concepts and difficult concepts so the learners are easily able to distinguish between the terminology used. And most importantly, support the learners in identifying the appropriate factual information to support their answer so that they stick to the relevant facts and that they don't get confused with concepts and terminology. Those 4 common mistakes should be focused on in all our teaching and our assessment. And this will help the learners to make unnecessary mistakes in their final exam and really help to improve their results.